the idea, so the CitySync is what I'm presenting. This is a project I just launched, as Ben just said, just recently. And so I just started working on this. It's been on my mind for many, many years. And it's something actually very difficult to convey. CitySync is a difficult idea because it, challenges kind of the very frame through which people understand government. And most of us have been conditioned to think of governance as something done to us, a service that we consume, a structure we complain about, or some type of, distant authority that we, occasionally interact with. So CitySync tries to kind of flip that paradigm entirely. It asks people to imagine government as an open network that they can actually participate in, and this kind of like living infrastructure that responds to human input the way an ecosystem does. So for some people it's a hard mental leap, because it's not just a new product or app. It's kind of a new ontology for governance. And so it kind of blends the language of civic duty with cryptographic systems, and social contracts with smart contracts. And so the result is a concept that sits somewhere between technology, economics, and this kind of idea of a collective identity. And so it really doesn't fit neatly into any category people already understand. And so CitySync isn't trying to sell efficiency. It's trying to kind of rewrite the operating logic of civic life as we participate in it. And of course, that's never been an easy story to tell. But so the best example I can provide that might provide a good sense, or some type of context, is how we understand public value. We're all here because we're aligned with the idea of public value. But in order to understand the core problem with creating public value, is we need to understand the system that it's currently centered in. And if we look at something like, okay, the aim of the private sector has always been to produce private value to shareholders. And likewise, the aim of the public sector is to produce public value to communities. But we often fumble with the equation of what exactly is public value and how it should be measured. And so if we look at the private sector, the consumer provides us with a very simple equation for value. The consumer uses their hard-earned money to pay for a product or service. And if that product or service is sold at a higher price than what was required to produce it, then the value of that enterprise can be measured. If people don't pay for it, then the enterprise is no longer able to produce that product or service. And so, you look at that and you go, within this kind of simple equation exists a governance system that dictates what is produced by a free market society. And so now if we look at the public sector, the public sector's mission is always to provide public goods and services that don't fit nicely into this kind of profit-driven model. And these goods are services that are focused on mitigating a lot of the externalities of such a highly efficient governance system that enshrines consumer sovereignty above everything else. And so in our efforts to kind of mitigate those externalities, we've relied on our systems of government to determine what types of public goods should be produced and how that public value should be measured. And so in many, progressive societies like, the United States, a lot of democracies, there's this kind of prevailing perception that, government is inefficient and ineffective in addressing those externalities. And so they naturally fail to see the kind of benefits government produce, and they do produce valuable benefits to society. But on the other hand, governments have a tendency to look at the benefits that they provide us and know that they are creating public value, but fail to see that the creation of that public value comes at the cost of private consumption. And so they utilize this kind of the coercive power of taxation and the broader rules and guidelines that are set out to regulate private consumption in order to create public value. And this is directly set against kind of the values of, individual liberty and entrepreneurship that are kind of established core values of democratic societies, at least. So, when we look at government, our desire to maintain this kind of like, representative democracy, at least in democracies, when it comes to deciding what public values produce, is often tempered with the fact that such a governance system is extremely vulnerable to corruption and misappropriation. And if such value cannot be produced within the private sector and our public sector is ill-equipped to match its efficiencies, what other alternatives can we create? And that's where CitySync, it was motivated by. It was this kind of desire to figure out the different logics within the public sector and figure out a way where we can create public value that isn't constantly running up against the inefficiencies of government or competing against the efficiencies of the private market. So before I get started with this presentation, I'm sorry about that. I have a tendency to ramble. But I want to start by asking everyone to kind of think about something. I want you to think about the governments you live under. Like, really think about them. Who are the actors? What is happening right now? Now, did you think about your local government or your national government? Did it instill some type of fear or optimism? Now I want you to think about the policies that matter to you. What are the people talking about? What are your priorities? Were you able to identify any of them? Did they actually impact you personally, or are they based in some type of ideology you align with? And so if you ask these questions and go through this kind of thought process, most of us, the truth is that, no matter what your thoughts are about government or the policies you care about, you likely envision it as part of a system operating on your world and not a system where you were, participating in. It's often a system that you are disconnected and not an active agent within. And so we feel that disconnection every day, not just politically, but socially. And we've forgotten what it really means to live in a shared space and to take responsibility for what happens around us. We talk about community, but it's most of us experience it as some type of, nostalgia. And the truth is that the systems that we built to manage society have slowly taught us how to not participate in it. And at its foundation, that's what CitySync is trying to solve. Our governments, our bureaucracies, our civic institutions, they're all built in an age when information moved slowly, when hierarchy was, the only way to make sense of complexity. And for a while, it worked. It created order. It gave us structure. It got us to the place we are today. But now the world runs on networks. And our systems still run on processes and structures that disconnect citizens from the very structures that are, being hijacked for the purpose of control. And so we're watching, kind of these protections that were initially built by government of these kind of old architectures, and they're bending under the weight of these kind of new realities. And it comes in the form of things like shrinking budgets, watching decision makers make decisions with impartial or bad information, and we see the mistrust being placed in every single direction. And so CitySync is not a company or a crypto experiment. It's a process. It's a transitory framework that helps governments and citizens gradually move toward decentralized governance in a responsible way. Because we can't just throw out our institutions and hope something better emerges. We need to evolve carefully, deliberately, from this kind of like centralized administration to this peer-to-peer coordination. And that's the fundamental purpose of CitySync. Governments need new systems they can trust, and citizens need to relearn how to act together as one. It's not enough to build just decentralized technology. We have to start instilling decentralized behavior, and that's a whole nother problem to overcome. So CitySync does seek to be the bridge between these worlds, to provide some type of compliant, gradual path for cities to modernize public administration while keeping stability and trust intact for those who are existing in this world. So the vision is simple, but it's ambitious. Let's see. Mhm. um, every city in the world should have its own blockchain. That is what at the core that CitySync seeks. A local proof of authority chain that serves as kind of the digital infrastructure for governance. Um, these chains can be, lightweight, um, standardized, and run by local civic institutions, universities, nonprofits, and government agencies, acting as validators. And on top of those chains, we will live what we call DPANs. Is something I've talked about previously in different presentations. Um, but it's a mouthful. But think of it this way: every department in a local government, whether it's parks, housing, waste management, public works, can be mirrored as a decentralized application. And so instead of being managed for citizens, it's coordinated by citizens through transparent systems anyone can audit and participate in. And so we're not trying to replace government, but to distribute it, to turn public administration into something that people can engage with directly. And so within this vision, each city chain is interoperable with others. That means, citizens' civic identity, their participation record, their volunteer work, their reputation, they can all travel with them. If you move from San Francisco to Barcelona, your civic record can move with you. You carry your citizenship in a sense as a kind of this living, breathing thing. Now, underneath all of this is what I'm proposing as the kind of the CitySync stack, which is kind of the technical foundation for how it works. And as you can see, every city will have a local chain, and each chain has local validators. And civic institutions that already hold legitimacy and public trust can actually serve as validators or nodes in those validators within these local chains. And on top of that chain are kind of these three standard components. We have the volunteer network DApp, which is kind of a core application that comes with every local chain. We have our standardized on-chain assets, and then we have our DPAN applications. And so, and on top of that, we have the DPAN marketplace and kind of the mobile application and interfaces that local government, citizens, and public sector institutions can engage with. So the layers here are, they're there for a purpose. And it's very important to understand that, for example, the on-chain assets contain, things like city and vote, which we'll talk about in a second. And the DPAN marketplace and DPAN applications are designed to effectively, eat away at government functions as time moves on. The volunteer network DApp is where everything begins. This is how citizens onboard onto a local chain, and they engage with government in small, low-level public administration functions. Now, let's see here. So yeah, the idea here is that we have our volunteer network DApp, and departments and agencies within local governments. They all have functions and work that they do that require cash outlays that they don't really need to be doing. I mean, they get bogged down with a lot of simple things like verification, mutual monitoring, things that they don't, they don't need to be focused on. A lot of these agencies and departments need to be focusing on the higher level areas of development, the big infrastructure pieces. And so the idea for the volunteer network app is to provide agencies and local government departments to actually offer these low-level functions and distribute them as tasks within your local city for citizens to volunteer with. And the idea here is that citizens will engage with these opportunities because they're incentivized by the local currency, or what we were calling a civic credit system at the beginning. And the idea is that city is something you earn. So there is this kind of dynamic where we're trying to incentivize the execution of public functions with a civic credit system that is backed by your local government. Let's see. So here's some examples of some of the low-level functions and opportunities that public local governments can provide. Now, these offerings are, subject to different cities and what they may offer. Not every city is the same, not every country is the same, but every city has some type of low-level function that they wish they could get rid of. That is a universal fact. And so by being able to offer this through a distributed ledger that's locally run, locally owned, they can engage with trust, and start offering these different types of tasks for the public to engage in. And like I said, all of these tasks have some type of financial cost associated with them that is predetermined and quantifiable. And so when citizens go and engage with these, they can earn city and they can earn vote. Vote is kind of the governance token that is, one-to-one transferable, and we'll get into that. But really, the creativity of what kind of opportunities exist is really up to the agencies themselves. You're providing them an opportunity to say, hey, how do we unload some of this busy work that we don't need to have and get more citizen engagement within the execution of local public functions? And I do think that's a huge value add for local governments that will actually save money. And so, there's a lot of functions that exist. And I always come back to park maintenance because city governments spend, at least in large areas, spend, millions of dollars every year, maintaining parks and cleaning parks. And you can facilitate that work easily with the Volunteer Network app. And that's $1 million in offset, of cash outlays that you don't need to pay for anymore. And so the idea is to incentivize them, because all local governments have reached this kind of financial limitation where you keep kicking the can down the road by offering bonds and other, financial instruments that don't really solve the problem. They just, push it to taxpayers later on. And so that's a real issue that I think, is another incentive for local governments to get engaged. So the way it works is that, the local government offers these opportunities, and there's a value of that distributed labor that they're offsetting. Citizens get to earn city, and then they get to use that city for, P2P offerings and public goods and services that are offered by the local governments themselves. And so you can think of, your bus pass or your parking, integrating a civic credit system or currency into the use of different utility functions within the city could be extremely valuable. And the great thing is that if a local government offers a lot of public goods and services and people utilize those public goods and services, there's more of a demand for city and therefore more demand of executing public functions. And so if you look at this equation, basically it's net benefit to government is equal to the administrative savings minus the city redemptions. As long as that's more than zero, then your local government is saving money, and it will almost always be greater than zero, because they can dictate the price and the redemption cost of every civic credit. And so we can experiment with this, gradually over time and see what type of incentives we can create among the public to engage in this type of behavior. And the great thing is you already have built-in audiences, people who use the bus. They use the bus every day, and instead of paying out of fiat currency out of their own pocket to pay for these bus passes, you just say, hey, come volunteer for 2 hours. Go verify some form, go check out this, go report on that. And it allows you to actually effectively engage in this verifiable public work in a transparent way. And you start to shift, government behavior and communal behavior towards this more decentralized type of engagement. And so that's kind of at the heart of it. So here's some examples for how you can use City. This is, like I said before, it's not comprehensive, but you can start to utilize City in a ton of different ways. And I think, local taxes is another one, property taxes, parking, event tickets, permit reductions, library fees. There's a whole list of different value that can be provided or subsidized by your local government, where they're not taking any financial risk. That's one of the keys to this format, is that in order for a local government to engage, it needs to minimize risk as much as possible. And that's why I'm proposing this kind of local POA chain. I'm proposing the use of utility and redemption for City as limited to the public sector. It's not like you can use City for buying a burrito at your local community. Although, the P2P offerings is where things get interesting, because if, your local burrito shop has an incentive for these kind of local civic credits, they might offer it, and there's nothing preventing them from doing so. It's just about generating the scale you want, and soon we can move on from, a budget-backed version of City to other, long-term layered versions of a community currency. So at its heart, that's what that is. And then vote. Vote is a way to provide governance in a local administrative capacity. And vote focuses on three dominant areas: DPAN management, public proposals, and participatory budgeting. Vote is issued on a one-to-one basis with City, and it is non-transferable. And so the idea behind vote is that in order to influence the direction and steer, and influence your city, policies, budgets, all of it, you got to have some skin in the game. It means you have to have contributed to betterment of your local community. And this represents that. And so every vote you have is matched with every city you earned. And so the idea is that if the more you contribute to your local city, your local community, the more influence you have over the direction it takes in terms of policies, in terms of the administrative structures that emerge, and how public money is spent. And so I do think this is very important, because it also abstracts the idea of identity and citizenship, and location. You don't have to be a resident to participate in this. If you wanted to, you could, if you contributed a ton for 2 years in one location and you decided to move, but you still care about that city, you could still wield your influence. There's nothing stopping you from that, because every form of voice that exists within this type of system has been earned with some type of civic contribution to the betterment of people that are currently living there. And so I do think that's a really important notion as well. So this is the other part of it, which is decentralized public administration networks. At the beginning, the opportunities that are offered are low-level functions. But the goal here is to create larger decentralized applications on this local chain that attempt to eat away at the larger government functions, public works departments. How do you fix roads? How do you deal with, procurement issues? The idea here is that you want to build reliable applications that encompass and create a modular approach towards these large chunks of government functions. And they're dedicated apps that are built on this local chain. And so they're governed through vote, and they're actually designed by people who are interested in creating a particular solution within a department. And hopefully you would see that local governments actually help participate in this process. If it's efficient and it's cost reductive, local governments will have an incentive to keep allowing citizens to actually facilitate these larger level functions within local governments. And so that's what DPANs are designed to do. And here's excuse me, here's some kind of DPAN categories that I've been trying to create some type of taxonomy on, but it's quite difficult. But the major DPAN categories here are civic engagement and volunteerism, governance and representation, public works infrastructure, social services, so on and so on. And then there's a primary focus with example ideas for DApps and administrative functions they're designed to replace. And so that's the essence of what DPANs are. So with that being said, we're hoping that it reframes the relationship between citizen and government. Instead of being managed by bureaucracy, it's become this kind of like partners within governance, and that's the kind of reform that rebuilds legitimacy. And so CitySync itself is, as an organization, it exists to support that transition. I know I haven't explained it in depth at the detail that I want to yet, but CitySync, to get it across, we're not here to govern cities. We're here to study, to prototype, and to document. The role of CitySync is to build case studies and collect data and establish best practices and implement these pilots all around this idea of decentralized administration. And so we want to be able to measure impact and socially and financially and make those findings available for replication. You can think of CitySync as kind of a research and development layer for the next generation of governance. We can build the infrastructure, the frameworks, and the trust that allows cities to evolve safely. But that's part that part is the hardest to say. So right now the project is still small, and it's something I work publicly on every Sunday for about 3 hours, designing, writing, mapping. It's usually just me in that Discord, just talking to myself, and it's quite a sight to see if you could just peek in there every once in a while. But and it's clear that it can't stay small for long, and to build this, we need others. We need developers who can kind of see the potential, the civic potential of code, and we need policy thinkers who understand how to translate between institutions and networks, and we need designers and writers and organizers to help with the implementation and conveying of the ideas to people who believe that governance can be better than it is now. If you've ever felt disillusioned by how little say you have in your community, or if you've ever looked at the systems around you and thought, we could do this better, then CitySync is kind of your invitation to start building that better vision. And so this isn't about replacing government. It's about syncing it and aligning it with the kind of the digital and social realities of our time. So that's the future that I'm trying to build toward, and I hope you'll come help build it with me. But if not, no worries. I'm just going to keep plugging away until it's done. But yeah, if you're interested in learning a little bit more, not necessarily from my voice, but my thoughts, I do have a lot of essays that I've written that give some context for it. But with that being said, I'll just kind of leave it there and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Nate. That was amazing. Yeah, we're getting a lot of emoji responses in the off-camera folks. This is just so perfectly Open Civics coded. Like when I said find the others, what I really meant is like Open Civics is not an idea that like Patricia or I or even our other co-founder came up with. It really is this like emergent realization that it feels like you've tapped into the exact same strain of thought that we've tapped into, and it's just like different expressions of the same kind of underlying inspiration of like, let's reimagine the social contract in the context of networks, and take all the affordances of the digital age and actually like re-embed them into our institutions until there's nothing left of those institutions. And I love how explicit you are about kind of gradually eating away at those functions. So I really want to encourage other folks to think about questions that they might want to ask. Oftentimes in this Q&A period, I end up doing most of the talking, but I'm super excited about everything that you just shared, Nate. And so I have a couple questions that I want to lob back your way. And I would just encourage other folks to either write their questions in the chat, or as soon as Nate answers this question, jump in. I really appreciate your intention of the gradual, like a lot of people either have a kind of revolutionary or reformist attitude. Like we either overthrow it completely or we gradually, like incrementally reform it from its own internal logic. And this is a beautiful hybrid of those two things. It feels very revolutionary in that it's like a fundamental reimagining. And it also is tempered in the sense that it's meeting these institutions where they're at, providing a value proposition that's in their own logic. Like we're going to improve services, reduce costs, increase a sense of community ownership. This is good for everyone. So it's framing it in their logic and looking at that kind of sequence. But when the first thought that I have, and given that this is something that I personally think that this is where we end up, but where I get hung up oftentimes is how much entrenched bureaucracy there currently is. And that's where the revolutionary in me comes out, is when I start to come up against just how interlocked it is, then I'm like, all right, screw it, we got to start over. And so I wonder if how you thought about that transition process occurring. Do you feel like the network state movement or these kind of like parallel, like network fundamental institutions might kind of front run local governments and then kind of road test prototypes to develop a certain kind of legitimacy for them to be adopted in a more institutional setting? Or do you feel like there are kind of small wins that we can start to chip away at that sort of build trust in these parallel network systems? And how do you see that transition happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. It's really hard to predict the future. I do agree with you that we are entrenched in a lot of bureaucracy that is really hard to overcome. And really, you know, the one thing that I disagree with a lot of views from the kind of the revolutionary type of approach is that, you know, government is just made of people, and most of these people in government, I would say majority of them, they're not the egotistical, you know, people that you see on the top levels of our government, because you have to be some type of, you know, sociopath a little bit to reach that degree of engagement and popularity. So you know, when I talk with local governments or people who work in local governments, they're I mean, if they weren't so consumed with the bureaucracy, and they were educated a little bit more in the digital realm, and they had a better understanding of the technical infrastructure that could be proposed as alternatives, they would be open to it. And that's one thing that I think the misconception for a lot of people is when it comes to local governments in particular, is that these organized like governments are they're drowning. Like every single one of them. You know, they're 20 to 30% of their budget is going to pensions and retirement funds, and it's only growing year by year by year, and they're kicking the can down the road every single year. And so they're starting to look for solutions, the alternatives to lock into. And so I do think that when you look at the overall structure of how government works, we really need to be talking on a local level, because most of the local level folks are looking for solutions. When you get higher up into the state and federal levels, not so much. You know, there's a kind of a natural deterrence where they're disconnected from the day-to-day life of individuals and lack the, you know, kind of social pressures that are that exist to actually perform better and to look at things in a different light. And so I do see that the potential of this kind of emergent changing from the local level to the state level to the federal level, where if you can revolutionize how local government it operates, it forces these levels above it to alter as well. And so I do think that is one revolutionary approach that could be you know, explored. When it comes to digital polities and the network state concept, it's a viable trajectory. I really do believe that, you know, we're going to have these types of digital organizations that become extremely powerful. And you'll be able to have that network state type of concept. But like I wrote in my essay, like it's one of those things that you can't have these types of digital organizations with that much power and still overlook the local infrastructure of shared geography. We all share a common space, and we all share this kind of place that we call home. The people around us, the neighbors, the institutions that we rely on to get to work, to go to the grocery store, all these things. You can't just ignore those things because you're participating in some opt-in network that you believe will have power and wield influence over your local community. It's going to create conflict. We need local coordination regardless of what type of future comes next. And so I do think that when it comes to tearing it down, yeah, I mean, I would be behind it if it didn't have so much goddamn collateral damage associated with it. People don't really truly appreciate what it means to tear something down and not provide any alternatives to lock into. You have to make that a priority. And so I do think that if we can embed ourselves within local governments and talk their language and speak their needs, we can slowly transform them from the inside out, acting as like a cancer, if you will, and just say, yep, this is where we're living now. This is what we're doing. And so you can start to eat away at that monopoly with this autonomy. So yeah, I hope that answered the question, but yeah.
Totally did. Over to you, Rather. Yeah, more of an immune response, just to say, not just a cancer, an immune response. Rather Mercurio.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Like, this has been awesome. I'm totally vibing with you, and it's great. Love it. Um, I think that you and Benjamin are speaking to different perspectives on revolution. Uh, I would guess that maybe Benjamin's approach might be to overthrow the state as a means to actually make social change, whereas you seem to be speaking of the right-wing version of revolution, which is to overthrow the government, but to leave the state intact as the apparatus by which capital maintains control of society. I think those are two completely different things. Um, yeah, and there are revolutions that don't involve replacing the government, right? That's just one very specific realm. But yeah, totally agreed that like most of the people in the government actually just want to provide civic functions, right? Sorry, I'm doing yard work. I'm out of breath. Um, but like at least in my experience, even in friendly places like Canada, you can do a lot of work with governments and get a lot of buy-in and do a really great job. And then all of a sudden the state apparatus comes in and says, nope. We did a really great project in Ontario, funded by Natural Resources Canada. We had government buy-in, right? We hired block science, we convened the stakeholders, we did the whole thing, right? And we designed a protocol for coordinating the funding of energy efficiency retrofit upgrades. Like you're saying, take a small civic function, replace it, and do that over time. And we had the whole protocol designed. It was Jeff Emmett and Jessica Zartler job. They did an amazing job. And basically, Enbridge Energy, which kind of holds Canada by the short and curlies for natural gas, they came in and they said to Anarcan, hey, if you fund this, kiss your pipeline project goodbye. So they're putting a pipeline from the Gulf to Ontario, $150 billion pipeline, right? And little scrappy folks like us trying to make small changes that make a big impact. Well, we can't compete with that, right? It's not like we have 150 billion bucks laying around to help solve the problem. And that's an example of the state interfering with the government process. The state apparatus of capital controlling society is fundamentally different from the government. And I think that is a difference that's worth keeping in mind when we're talking about the levers of power at our disposal to reshape society, because they're totally different approaches, even though we use the same word.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with that. I mean, you're not going to get rid of the state. You can change the government, but the idea of the state will remain for a while until we start to alter the government completely. And then you can start to have different conceptions of what the state actually is. And I will say that we're going to continue to run into these problems. And that's why I think that having a kind of a standardized framework and a model that we can implement, even if it doesn't work in one city, we just say, oh, okay, fuck it, we'll do it another one. But every win that you do get becomes leverage and pressure on the existing cities to say, hey, it worked over here in India, it worked over here in Brazil, it worked over here in the United States, it can work here in Canada. And if you try to push it back, and maybe they'll keep doing it and over again. But guess what? The more wins you start piling up, the harder it is to say no. And the more difficult it will become when citizens become aware that these other alternative systems exist, that you say, hey, this is something that we need to lock into. And so a big part of that is driving down the cost of actually creating this infrastructure. I think that the open source revolution is going to be able to do that specifically for blockchains as well. And when it comes to smart contract development, when it comes to implementing these like local chains and the costs associated with that, if we can drive those costs down, we can increase the amount of pilot projects that are actually attempted and implemented on local levels. And if we can start with kind of this like broad, framework or model that we can implement, then we can really start, chipping away city by city and town by town, whatever it might be, and just show, we can just prove over and over again that says, hey, look, we were able to save this much money. We were able to cut down on the amount of people having to work for government. This is how many people started engaging. This is the social impacts. These are the financial impacts. These are the public value impacts that we've created. And we pile up those wins as much as we possibly can. And soon it'll become so big that you can't ignore it anymore. And so it's not an easy path, but I do think that it is more effective than outright revolution. People need to have buy-in. People need to have some sense of ownership over the infrastructure that they're working with and the new set of infrastructure that is going to be built for this digital era. And if we can't do that, if we resort to, attempting to overthrow the state, attempting to overthrow our governments, you're going to have a split between whatever, support of whatever comes next, because the people who wanted to maintain the old infrastructure are going to be 100% against it, no matter what you do or say. That's just the nature of how all revolutions and coups have ever worked. It never solves the conflict. It just defers it to a later point in time. And so we need to have universal support for these types of reforms. And it's a very hard thing to do, but I do think that if we come up with a model that allows people to see successes and start banking these wins, it's going to be harder and harder for people to ignore and governments to say no to.
I'm wondering if Diogo, I really appreciate that we have the opportunity to have a kind of a more global conversation. This has been a little bit North American focused, and having spent a little bit of time in Brazil, I know that there's many indigenous and landless peoples, social movements, and a rich history of kind of socialism, and the Bolsonaro government being the kind of the most recent expression of like the hyper extraction. And there's been a lot that's happened in the last 5 to 10 years in Brazil. I wonder if you have any perspectives around this kind of network transition at the municipal or state level in a Brazilian context, given the kind of historical and social conditions of Brazil right now, and what that could look like in Brazil.
Yeah, I don't have too much context on Brazil in particular, whether it's Rio or any other type of municipality or city, but any.
I was going to see if maybe Diogo wouldn't mind coming on and sharing a little bit with us.
Okay.
And then maybe we respond to that, because I'm just curious if I wanted to make sure to invite him in. If you had anything in particular you wanted to share from that perspective.
Oh, first, thanks, Nate, for this presentation. Really, really interesting and useful. I'll share later how I think of using that. But regarding Dan's question, we have, there was this right-wing populist more recently, and a left-wing populist 20 years. So people became dependent on governments. People lost their autonomy. They folks during the ecological movement, they used to create, NGOs and associations for resolving problems, and now they do this to get a job, so to get funds from the government. So it's like an NGO, but it's government dependent. So it's like crazy. And I saw that, my generation saw that. My friends enter college with the autonomy mindset and left with the government dependence mindset. So it sucks. But when I see this, it's such a high level vision for society. And the topic was governments or state. These are the topics and felt like these were like where we need to tackle, what we need to tackle. They are kind of the enemy, or what we need to as immune cells fix. But maybe we could, not that, but that approach, if we ever get to that spot, it's top down. Feels like you wanted to create new laws with your perspective and put it to other people. And maybe if we think of a bottom-up approach, finding the peers that share this mindset in your region, maybe in the school, other families, parents, and because I think I'm older. I'm old, 45, and like my daughter is 11 now, growing, and like you start thinking of like, man, change takes a long time, and sometimes we aim at the wrong side. Maybe if we look at the other side and aim at that, at schools, at community, and in this case, the U.S. is so organized as communities, as school communities, and they make, from sports to fundraising for something, there's all this seasonal activities and all kind of stuff. I feel that could be a more a richer sandbox or playground, a place to experiment with this economy than going to battle against governments and politicians. Like in my but like coming back to the politics situation in Brazil back in 2000 when the first left-wing Lula populist came. He was not that populist back then, but he focused a lot on a few things that he gave up later. One was like open source software. They opened school in schools and all that, Linux computers and all of that. It was pretty cool. But they focused on solidarity economy, and social currencies. And that was at the same time, 2000, 2001, Argentina got that big crash. They couldn't withdraw money, and just developed a huge solidarity network for swaps, many swap meets and this kind of events. Many social currencies happened as a response to the crisis, to the economic crisis. So and I think Latin America saw a lot of that and experienced a little bit of this, but so does US. There's a lot of flea markets, right? There's a lot of secondhand stuff. And what basically, it's interesting because like you gave me a great idea. Like I'm together with Ceci from Bolivia and a friend from Argentina, organizing a pop-up week during DevConnect. And we're gonna have a social currency. We're gonna have a bazaar for secondhand goods and services. You know, we're gonna sell tickets to our events and workshops. And then let's say we have some profits. How do we govern that? And then I loved the frame of the vote token, right? You can buy one share, swap 1-on-1 with the currency for voting. That's really cool. So yeah, I think, but then it came, you gave that taxonomy of services and all, and it comes when you try to put that in place, you stumble into that problem of how much do I charge for this, right? The pricing. And we are just going through that in the same, in the micro level, like during this 1 week on DevConnect, how much do we charge for a book? How much do we charge for a ticket to a dinner? You know, and whatever the price is, we will decide it collectively together, at least among a council of people, and it's gonna run. Let's see what happens. But so I think it's going to be useful for us. It could be useful to you just to start doing it at some level. You know, start pricing things on social currencies. Start, you know, swapping. Start trading. So, but wow, I really look forward to when we're gonna get there. But in Brazil, I think it's more easy to become a parallel governance or economy, and the politicians will keep printing and doing their thing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really awesome, and I hope that with those experiments you can actually, you know, aggregate some learnings and you know, find out, you know, what works, what doesn't, how people react, how people engage, how hard it was to onboard potential citizens, new citizens, whether they came back. That's the type of information we need to start documenting, because there's a lot of experiments happening all over the world. And one of the reasons that I think that, you know, I really want to have these kind of idea of a local chain is because it allows for a consistent substrate to go back to where you can have experiments and you can have all these things, but it's not just used for that one of use case. It has multiple use cases, and so you don't have to you know, work with all these different experiments that are happening in the same location. You have a single chain, a single application that you're utilizing for a bunch of different, you know, Web3 approaches towards, you know, engagement and governance. And so I do think that there's a huge value of all of these experiments, but we need to start aggregating that knowledge and that information, because, you know, from my own experience within Oakland, we've tried out community currencies, and I have a thing of you know, a list of learnings and you know, what worked and what didn't, and kind of a big retrospective on these experiments. And there's just not anything I can compare it to, because we're not engaging with each other like we should. And I hope Open Civics becomes that kind of foundation for that type of information sharing and data gathering. And so you know, when it comes to Brazil and you know, the you know, population there, I imagine it would probably be easier to implement something like CitySync in Brazil than it would be here in like Oakland or Berkeley, simply just because of the regulatory environment that is the United States, and it sucks balls and I hate it so much. But you know, it's one of those things where you actually don't need to have to integrate with the local government either. You know, that's just a preference. That's something that I would like to see happen. But in all honesty, you can have P2P administration structures and just bypass all government completely. It would take a little bit more work and a little bit more on the getting creative on the incentives side of things to get people engaged in that type of activity. The only reason I approached it from this kind of government integration process was to actually have, you know, a legitimate pathway for local governments to reform themselves and to create the natural incentives that exist. That is the honeypot of local government funds. So if you can figure out a way to get creative with the incentives for the engagement of public functions, you can bypass local government altogether. And if it works effectively, you don't need to even bother with them. You can just do it, and there's nothing they can do to stop you. And it's, you know, that's one of those kind of alternative routes that we can play around with and look at. But yeah, it really takes a lot for the incentives to change the behaviors that naturally exist. Like you said, we've been so dependent on government for such a long time that we forgot how to be autonomous and independent, and to, you know, we see a piece of trash sit on the street and we say, who's going to pick that up? The city is doing a shit job, and it's like, well, you go pick it up. We don't have that type of independent, you know, thought processes anymore because we've been trained for so long now. And so, I mean, I'm open to any ideas or trajectories that might not involve local governments in general, and that we can bypass it. I'd be happy to do so. But I do think that the city sync is like the model that I've proposed, is that here's a pathway for you to reform yourself, local government. I hope you would take it. But, you know, if that doesn't work, then the alternative will have to suffice at some point.